Hey, welcome back. Go ahead and get comfortable. Really comfortable. Shift your pillow around if you need to. Pull the blanket up over your shoulders. Let your jaw relax. Let your hands go heavy. There. Good. Tonight we're talking about Appalachian mountain families. The people who lived up in those hills in places like West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, Western North Carolina, and East Tennessee back in the 1800s and early 1900s. And before you picture anything, I want you to stop for a second, because whatever just popped into your head, it's probably wrong. That's not your fault. That's just what the movies and the old TV shows gave you. You've seen the stereotype. Moonshine stills hidden in the woods. Family feuds with shotguns. Folks who never left the holler their whole lives. Suspicious of anybody from down below. Maybe a banjo playing somewhere in the background while somebody gets chased through the trees. And sure, a few of those things happen here and there. To some people, some of the time. But that's not what most days looked like. Not even close. Most days for an Appalachian mountain family were slow. They were quiet. They were full of small chores that nobody ever thought to put in a movie. Chopping wood, carrying water, mending a shirt by the fire. Nobody's making an action scene out of that. Well, tonight we are. Sort of. We're going to slow all the way down and just look at it. Hour by hour. Chore by chore. The real, plain truth of what these families actually did all day, every day, up in those hills. We'll talk about mornings, what it actually felt like to wake up in a 1 or 2 room cabin before the sun was even up. We'll talk about food, the real food, not the movie version. Cornbread, beans, salt pork, whatever came out of the garden that week. We'll talk about the work, which never really stopped, but which also wasn't nearly as dramatic as people think. And we'll talk about the evenings, the quiet ones, the ones that look nothing like a Hollywood feud. Here's the thing I like best about real history. Ordinary people, living ordinary days, are a lot more interesting than the movies give them credit for. Not in some big dramatic way, in a quiet way, a grounded way. These families weren't cartoons. They weren't punchlines. They were people raising children, growing food, building homes with their own hands, and getting through hard winters with whatever they had. And they did almost all of it without anybody writing it down or making a fuss about it. So let's slow down together and take a real look. Let your body settle a little further into the bed. Let your arms go heavy. Let your breathing slow down just a little right now. Tonight's going to be calm. Tonight's going to be quiet. We're going to move through this the same way these families move through their days. Steady, unhurried, one small moment at a time. And by the time we're done, you'll know the real version. The one that's a lot more boring than the movies. Which, around here, is exactly the point. Let's get into it. Section 1: Morning Life and Daily Routines. Let's start at the beginning of the day, before the sun's even up. Appalachian mountain families lived spread out, mostly. not in towns, up in hollers. That's the word folks use for those narrow valleys tucked between the ridges, or on a hillside farm a good walk from the nearest neighbor. Families were often isolated, sometimes by miles of rough trail, sometimes just by the simple fact that the mountains made travel slow no matter where you were headed. A lot of these families had been there for generations. Scots-Irish settlers had come into these hills back in the 1700s, looking for land that was cheap, or sometimes just land that nobody else wanted yet. Their descendants stayed. Mountain life got passed down generation after generation, mostly unchanged for a long, long time. So when we talk about back then, we're really talking about a stretch of time that ran from somewhere in the 1800s all the way up into the early 1900s, where daily life on a mountain farm looked pretty similar no matter what decade you picked. That's part of what makes this so calming to think about, honestly. It wasn't rushed. It didn't change fast. It just kept going the same way year after year. Mornings started early, real early. Most families were up before sunrise, somewhere between 4:30 and 5:30, depending on the season. In the summer, with more daylight to use, people got moving even earlier. In the deep winter, when the sun didn't show up until later, they still got up in the dark because the animals didn't care what time the sun came up. The animals needed feeding no matter what. Here's where the movie version really falls apart. You picture a log cabin, maybe a little smoke curling out the chimney, somebody stepping out onto the porch with a peaceful look on their face, taking in the mountain view. Real pretty, real calm. The actual version was a woman or a man rolling out of a corn husk mattress in a cold room, because the fire from the night before had usually burned down to nothing by morning. Most cabins only had the one fireplace, maybe two if the family had built on a second room. That fireplace heated the whole house, and once everybody went to sleep, nobody was feeding it through the night. So mornings were cold, genuinely cold. You could see your breath some mornings, even inside. The first job of the day, almost every single day, was getting that fire going again. Somebody, usually whoever woke up first, which was often the wife or the oldest daughter, would go to the hearth and look for any leftover coals buried under the ash. If you banked the fire right the night before, meaning you covered the coals up careful with ash so they'd smolder slow instead of burning out, you might get lucky and find a little heat still there in the morning. If not, you were starting from scratch with flint and steel, or with matches if the family had money enough to buy them and remembered to keep a dry supply on hand. Once the fire was going, breakfast started. And breakfast, for most mountain families, was about as plain as food gets. Cornbread, or sometimes biscuits if there was enough flour and lard to spare. Maybe some salt pork or bacon fried up in a skillet, the grease saved afterward because grease was never wasted. Coffee if the family could afford to buy it, which not everybody could, especially out in the more remote hollers where the nearest store might be half a day's walk or more. Some families made do with a substitute, roasted chicory root, or even roasted grain, brewed up to taste something like coffee, even if it wasn't really coffee at all. Milk was common if the family kept a cow, which a lot of them did. Fresh milk in the morning, Maybe some of it set aside to make butter or clabber, which is just milk that's gone slightly sour and thick, eaten kind of like a simple yogurt. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. While breakfast was cooking, the rest of the morning chores were already underway because nobody waited around for food to be ready before starting work. Whoever was in charge of the animals, and this varied family to family, sometimes the husband, sometimes the wife, often the older children, was already out at first light, feeding the chickens, milking the cow if there was one, checking on the hogs, making sure nothing had gotten out of its pen overnight or gotten into trouble with a fox or a weasel. Water needed to be hauled, too. And this was one of those chores that doesn't sound like much until you actually think about what it meant every single day. Most mountain homes did not have running water. You had a spring nearby, hopefully close, sometimes not close at all, and you carried buckets back and forth. Cooking water, washing water, drinking water, all of it carried by hand, sometimes up a slope, sometimes down one, depending on where the spring sat relative to the house. Children were given this job early in life. A child as young as 6 or 7 might be sent down to the spring with a small bucket, while an older sibling carried two bigger ones. This wasn't considered hard on the kids by the standards of the time. It was just what kids did. Everybody worked, even the little ones, in whatever way their size allowed. Here's a boring fact that I think is actually pretty interesting, if you let it sit with you a minute. A lot of these mountain families didn't own clocks. Not because clocks were expensive, though some of them were, but because there just wasn't much need for one. The sun told you what time it was close enough. Roosters told you morning had come. Hunger told you it was about time to eat. Nobody was rushing to catch a train or clock in at a job most of the time, because most of this work was happening right there on the family's own land. So when I tell you breakfast happened early, that's a little bit of a loose idea. It happened whenever the morning chores allowed for it. Sometimes that was right after the animals were fed. Sometimes it stretched a little later if something else needed doing first, like a sick animal or a fence that had come loose overnight. After breakfast, the real workday started. For men and older boys, that usually meant heading out to the fields, if it was planting or harvest season, or out into the woods for chopping and hauling timber if it wasn't. For women and girls, it meant the long list of household chores that never seemed to actually end. We'll get into all of that work in detail in the next section, but for now, just picture it. The morning chores blending right into the daytime chores, with no clear line between getting ready for the day and doing the day's work. It was all just one long, steady stretch of motion. Let's slow down here for a second, because I want you to really picture this morning, the whole thing, slowly, one piece at a time. The dark room, the cold floor under bare feet, the careful work of coaxing a few sparks back into a real fire. The smell of that fire catching, finally, and starting to warm the room. The sound of a skillet being set down on the hearth. The smell of cornbread, plain and warm, filling up the small cabin. Outside, the sound of chickens stirring. A rooster somewhere close. The soft thud of bare or boot-covered feet on packed dirt, heading toward the barn or the spring house. No engines, no machines humming anywhere, just people and animals and the sound of water being poured from a bucket into a basin. That's the morning. Slow, plain, the same, more or less, every single day, for families who live this way for generations. And here's the thing about that kind of sameness. It's not exciting. It's not the stuff of movies. But there's something almost comforting in it if you sit with the idea long enough. You always knew what came next: the fire, the food, the animals, the chores. Day after day, the same gentle order to things. Let's keep moving through that morning a little more. Once the animals were fed and breakfast was done, there was usually a short window where the family figured out the shape of the day ahead. Not with a calendar or a planner, nothing like that. Just a quick conversation, usually short, about what needed doing. Maybe the weather was good for working in the field. Maybe a storm was rolling in over the ridge, which meant outdoor work needed to happen fast or get put off entirely. Reading the weather was its own quiet skill, one that got passed down the same way recipes did. Old timers paid attention to which way the smoke from the chimney was leaning. They watched how the animals were acting: cows lying down funny, chickens getting restless, that kind of thing. They looked at the clouds rolling over the mountain ridges, which could shift fast in hill country, turning a clear morning into a soaked afternoon without much warning at all. There wasn't a weather report on the radio for most of this time period, not in the remote hollers anyway. And even once radios did start showing up in some homes, a lot of families still trusted their own eyes and their own experience over anything coming out of a little box on the shelf. By the time the sun was fully up over the ridgeline, and in some hollers, that meant the sun didn't really hit the valley floor until later in the morning, since the mountains themselves blocked the early light. The day's real work was already well underway. The morning had already done its job. Fire built, animals fed, food eaten, water hauled, and all before what most of us would call a normal start to the workday. That's the quiet truth about Appalachian mornings. No big drama, no movie moments, just the steady, patient work of getting a household moving again after a cold night, the same way it had been done the morning before, and the morning before that, going back further than anybody in the house could really remember. Let's talk a little more about the seasons, too, because mornings didn't look quite the same all year round, even if the basic shape of them stayed similar. In the spring, mornings were about planting. As soon as the ground had thawed enough and the last real frost seemed to have passed, families were up early getting seed corn into the ground. There's an old practical wisdom a lot of these families followed, tied to certain plants blooming, like dogwood trees, which were said to signal it was finally safe to plant corn without losing the crop to one more cold snap. Nobody had a scientific explanation for why watching the dogwoods worked as well as it did. It just did, often enough that people trusted it. Summer mornings were about tending what had already been planted, weeding, watching for pests, making sure a dry spell didn't turn into a real problem for the corn and the garden both. Mornings in summer also started earliest of all, sometimes well before 4:30, because the heat of a mountain afternoon could be brutal, and getting the hardest outdoor work done before the sun was fully up made the whole day more bearable. Fall mornings shifted toward harvest. Corn needed gathering. The garden needed to be picked clean before frost killed everything off. This was also, As we'll talk about more in the next section, the season for that big once a year hog killing, which often happened on a cold morning specifically, since cold weather helped keep the meat from spoiling during the long process of butchering. And winter mornings, finally, were the slowest of the year, relatively speaking. Less field work to do, obviously, since nothing was growing. But the animals still needed feeding, the fires still needed building, and the days were short enough that families had to make good use of whatever daylight they got. A winter morning might start just as early as a summer one, even with the sun not showing up until later, simply because there was so little daylight to work with once it did arrive. So when we say morning for an Appalachian mountain family, we're really talking about a routine that flexed and shifted with the calendar, even while its basic bones stayed exactly the same, season after season, year after year. Let's also talk a little about just how isolated some of these mornings really were, because that isolation shaped almost everything about how the day unfolded. A lot of mountain families lived a genuine distance from their nearest neighbor. Not always, certainly. Some hollers were settled densely enough that you could see smoke rising from 3 or 4 other chimneys without much trouble. But plenty of families lived spread out enough that the nearest help, in any kind of emergency, might be an hour's walk away, or more, over rough trail that didn't always cooperate, especially after rain or snow. This meant a family's morning routine had to be entirely self-sufficient. There was no quick trip to a store for something forgotten. No easy way to send word to a neighbor except by walking there yourself or sending a child to run the errand. Whatever the household needed, it needed to already have on hand or know how to make, grow, or do without. This kind of isolation also meant mornings carried a quiet kind of responsibility that's hard for most of us to really picture today. If the fire failed to catch and there were no dry matches left, that wasn't a small inconvenience you could solve with a quick trip somewhere. It meant cold food or no food until somebody figured out a solution using whatever was on hand. If an animal got sick overnight, there was no veterinarian to call. The family handled it themselves, using whatever knowledge had been passed down or simply hoped for the best. None of this made mornings feel frantic or anxious most days. It just meant a kind of steady, practiced self-reliance sat underneath everything a family did every single morning, whether anybody consciously thought about it that way or not. You did things right, carefully, the same way each time, because there usually wasn't a backup plan waiting just down the road. Roads themselves, where they existed at all in these mountain areas, were often little more than wagon trails, rutted and rough, following the easiest path along a creek bed or through a gap in the ridgeline. Travel by wagon was slow and difficult. Travel on foot or by horse, much more common for shorter trips, still took real time given the steep, uneven terrain. A trip to the nearest general store, for families who had one within reasonable distance, might still take the better part of a day, round trip, which meant such trips happened only when genuinely necessary, not as a casual errand. This is part of why so much of mountain life centered on self-sufficiency. Not because these families were choosing isolation for its own sake, particularly, but because the terrain itself made anything else difficult. The mountains that gave this region its name also shaped, in ways large and small, almost every single decision a family made about how to live within them. Let's spend a little more time, too, on the animals themselves, since caring for them filled such a steady, constant part of every single morning, no matter the season. Hogs were usually allowed to roam somewhat freely through the surrounding woods for much of the year, foraging on their own for acorns, roots, and whatever else they could find, which kept the cost of raising them low. Families marked their hogs with a particular notch cut into the ear, a system that let everyone in a holler identify whose animal was whose, even when the hogs wandered well beyond any one family's immediate property. Come fall, these same hogs got rounded up and brought in for that year's hog killing, having spent most of the year fattening up largely on their own. Cattle, where a family kept more than just a single milk cow, might also graze more freely on mountain land that wasn't suited to farming, steep slopes too rocky or too uneven for crops, but perfectly fine for animals to wander and feed on. Checking on cattle scattered across this kind of open mountain range was its own regular task, sometimes requiring a genuinely long walk just to confirm the herd was still where it ought to be and that nothing had wandered off or gotten into trouble. Chickens stayed closer to home, generally, kept in a simple coop or allowed to range through the yard during the day, gathered back in at night to protect them from foxes, weasels, and other predators that lived in these same mountains. Gathering eggs, feeding the chickens, and making sure the coop stayed secure was often one of the very first chores handed to the youngest children in a household. Simple enough for small hands, but genuinely useful work all the same. Horses and mules, where a family had them, required more careful daily attention than cattle or hogs, given how much harder work they did. Feeding, watering, and checking on a working animal's overall condition mattered enormously, since a sick or injured horse or mule could set back an entire season's farm work. A family's animals represented real, hard-earned investment, and caring for them properly wasn't just kindness. It was plain economic necessity. Let's close out this look at mountain mornings with one final, slower thought. There's a particular kind of knowledge that built up inside a family simply from doing the same morning routine in the same order for years on end. A mother knew, without needing to think about it consciously, exactly how long the cornmeal needed on the fire before it was ready. A father knew, from years of repetition, exactly how a particular ox or mule liked to be approached and harnessed each morning, which animals needed a gentler hand, and which could be moved along briskly without complaint. This kind of deeply practiced, almost wordless knowledge is easy to overlook when we picture mountain life from the outside, focused as we often are on the hardship and the simplicity of it all. But there's real skill in it, real mastery, even built up slowly over years of doing the same careful work morning after morning in conditions that left very little room for mistakes. A mountain morning, in the end, was less about any single dramatic task and more about this whole accumulated rhythm. Fire, food, animals, water, each piece fitting into the next, the same patient order, repeated so many thousands of times across so many years that it became less like a list of chores and more like a kind of inherited, wordless choreography, passed down and practiced anew by each generation that took up the same daily work in the same mountain hollers their families had called home for so long. Section 2: Work and Jobs. Now let's talk about the work itself. The stuff that filled up the rest of the day, every day, for almost everybody in an Appalachian mountain family. Most of these families were farmers, not big farmers, not the kind with hundreds of flat acres and fancy equipment. Mountain farming was small, hard, and uneven because the land itself was uneven. You weren't working some wide open field. You were working a hillside, terrace sometimes, or just planted at an angle, with rocks you had to work around and soil that wasn't always great to begin with. A typical mountain farm grew corn as the main crop, because corn was about the most forgiving thing you could plant on rough ground. Corn fed the family directly, as cornbread and corn mush, and it also fed the animals. Whatever corn wasn't eaten by people got fed to the hogs and chickens, or got ground into meal that would keep for months. Alongside the corn, families usually kept a garden. Beans, especially. Beans were huge in these mountains, and not just any beans. A lot of families grew what folks called leather breeches, which is just dried green beans, strung up on thread and hung to dry in the kitchen or on the porch, so they'd keep through the winter without spoiling. You'd see strings of these beans hanging up like little curtains in a lot of mountain kitchens. Squash, potatoes, cabbage, and onions rounded things out, depending on the soil and the family's particular habits. Here's a boring fact that I think is honestly kind of nice to sit with. A lot of mountain families didn't think of farming as a job, exactly the way we think of jobs today. There was no paycheck at the end of the week, no boss to report to. The work was just what you did to stay alive and fed, and it folded into every other part of life so completely that nobody really separated work time from the rest of the day. It was just the day. The men and older boys spent a lot of their time on the heavier outdoor labor, plowing fields, usually behind a mule or an ox, since horses were sometimes too expensive or too delicate for rough mountain ground. Clearing new land, which meant cutting down trees, burning off brush, and pulling stumps, a process that could take years to fully clear a single decent-sized field. Building and repairing fences, usually made from split rails, since wire fencing wasn't always affordable or available out in the more remote spots. Timber work was common too, especially as the decades went on and lumber companies started moving into these mountains looking to buy up trees. Some men worked their own land, cutting timber to sell when they needed cash for things they couldn't grow or make themselves: salt, certain tools, maybe shoes for the children. Other men eventually went to work directly for logging companies or, later on, coal companies, once those industries pushed deeper into the hills. That work was harder, more dangerous, and ran on somebody else's clock instead of the family's own rhythm, which was a real shift for families used to working their own land at their own pace. Let's pause on that for a second, actually, because it's one of those quietly significant shifts in mountain life. For generations, these families worked according to the season and the weather and their own household's needs. Nobody was telling them when to start or stop. Once coal mining and large-scale logging moved in, some families, not all, but a good number, started sending men, and sometimes boys as young as 12 or 13 into wage work. A 6-day week, long hours underground or out in the timber camps. A real paycheck, finally, but also a real boss and real danger that hadn't existed in quite the same way before. We're not going to dwell on the dangerous parts. This isn't that kind of video. Just know that it happened and that it changed things slowly over time for a lot of mountain families. Women's work looked different, but it was just as constant, if not more so. There's an old saying that men's work was from sun to sun, but women's work was never done, and whoever first said that clearly knew what they were talking about, because it's basically true. A woman running an Appalachian mountain household was doing an enormous number of things, often all in the same day, sometimes all within the same hour. Cooking, obviously, 3 times a day, every day, with no days off. Washing clothes, which on a mountain farm meant hauling water, heating it over a fire, scrubbing everything by hand against a washboard, then hanging it to dry, weather depending. Tending the garden, which was usually her responsibility specifically, separate from the larger field crops the men handled. Canning and preserving food for the winter months, which was a massive seasonal task involving jars, lids, careful timing, and a whole lot of standing over a hot stove during the already hot summer months. And then there were the children. A lot of children, usually. Large families were the norm, partly because more hands meant more help with all this work, and partly because, frankly, there wasn't reliable birth control and infant mortality was high enough that families often had more children just to make sure enough survived to adulthood. A woman might be pregnant, nursing, or caring for a baby for a large stretch of her adult life, all while doing everything else we just listed. Listed. Here's a fact that might surprise you, and it's one of those genuinely modern feeling things. Mountain women complained. A lot. Not in some dramatic, movie villain way, but in letters, in diaries when they had the time and ability to keep one, in conversations with their neighbors. They complained about being tired, about never having a moment to themselves, about husbands who didn't appreciate how much work actually went into running a household. If you read some of the personal accounts that survive from this era and this region, the complaints sound almost exactly like complaints you'd hear today. Tired, overworked, wishing for just a little help, a little rest, a little recognition. That's the funny part about history sometimes. People separated from us by 100+ years, living in conditions totally different from ours, still ended up feeling a lot of the same basic things. Tired is tired, whether you're tired from a desk job or tired from hauling water up a mountain trail. Children work too, and pretty early in life by modern standards. By age 5 or 6, a child was already doing small chores, fetching water, gathering eggs, watching younger siblings. By 8 or 9, kids were doing real, substantial work, weeding the garden, feeding animals, helping with the harvest, carrying wood. Older boys, by their teenage years, were working right alongside their fathers in the fields or in the timber. Older girls were doing the same kind of work their mothers did, learning the whole list of household skills they'd need once they had their own households one day. Schooling, when it existed at all in a given holler, usually happened around the farm work rather than the other way around. A one-room schoolhouse, if the community had managed to build one, might only run for a few months out of the year, often in the winter, when there was less farm work demanding everybody's time. Some children walked a long way to get there, sometimes several miles each direction, through rough terrain, in whatever weather showed up that day. Other children, especially in the more remote or poorer families, got very little formal schooling at all because the family needed their labor more than the family needed them to learn reading and arithmetic. I want to mention one more boring but interesting fact here because I think it's a nice one to fall asleep thinking about. A lot of the actual day-to-day work in these mountain communities ran on a system of mutual help rather than hired labor. If a family needed to raise a barn, or bring in a harvest fast before bad weather hit, or butcher a hog, which was a big job requiring more hands than one family usually had, neighbors came together to help. This often had a name, depending on the specific task: a barn raising, a corn shucking, a hog killing, even, which sounds rough when you say it plainly, but which was really just the practical, communal way families got through the necessary, unglamorous task of preserving meat for winter. These work gatherings weren't just labor, either. They were social events too, in their own quiet, low-key way. Food got shared. Stories got told while everybody worked. Sometimes music happened in the evening once the work was done. It was hard work wrapped around a little bit of community and connection, which is honestly a pretty nice way to get through hard work when you think about it. So when we picture a mountain family's workday, let's get the real picture fixed in our minds, slow and steady. Men out clearing land or working timber or tending crops on steep, uneven ground. Women managing an endless, overlapping list of household tasks that never really had a clear stopping point. Children working too, in smaller ways, learning the whole pattern of adult life well before they actually became adults. And every now and then, neighbors coming together to share the heaviest tasks, turning hard labor into something a little more bearable, a little more connected. No feuds, no gunfights, no dramatic standoffs on a porch somewhere. Just steady, repeated, necessary work, the same as it had been done the season before and the year before that, going back generation after generation up in those quiet hills. Let's add a little more detail here, because the day-to-day rhythm of this work deserves to be slowed down and looked at more closely. A woman's workday, if we actually tried to list out everything in order, ran something like this. Early morning chores, which we already covered. Then breakfast cleanup, which on a mountain farm meant scrubbing pots and plates with water that had to be hauled and heated first. Then straight into the garden, weather permitting, checking on vegetables, pulling weeds, watching for pests that might ruin a crop the family was depending on. Midday brought the largest meal of the day, which needed preparing well before anyone was hungry enough to eat it, since cooking over an open hearth or a simple wood stove took real time and constant attention. After the midday meal and its cleanup, the afternoon usually turned toward whatever the bigger seasonal task happened to be. Washing clothes, if it was wash day, which for a lot of households fell on a specific day each week, often Monday, a tradition that carried over from much older European household habits brought into these mountains by the original settlers. Sewing or mending, if there was a pile of torn or worn out clothing that needed attention. Spinning or weaving, in households that still made their own cloth rather than buying manufactured fabric from a store. Then came supper preparation, supper itself, supper cleanup, and finally, once the children were settled toward bed, whatever quiet handwork a woman might still manage by firelight before her own body gave out for the night. Sewing, usually, since that was a task that could continue even in dim, flickering light, as long as your eyes held up. It's worth saying plainly, this was, by almost any honest measure, more total hours of labor in a day than most modern work schedules require. And it happened 7 days a week, with maybe a partial easing on Sunday for church and rest, depending on how strictly a particular family or community observed the Sabbath. Now let's go back to that idea of neighbors helping neighbors, because it really was one of the things that made this whole demanding system work at all. A corn shucking, for instance, might happen once the fall harvest was in. Neighbors gathered at one family's place, and everybody worked together stripping the husks off a season's worth of corn, piled up high in the yard or the barn. It was tedious work, genuinely, hour after hour of the same repetitive motion, but done together, with conversation and music and maybe a meal afterward, it became something closer to a party than a chore. A house raising worked the same basic way, but for building rather than harvesting. If a young couple was setting up their first home, or if a family's old cabin had finally worn past the point of repair, the whole community might turn out for a day or two, putting up the log walls together. Since notching and stacking heavy logs is genuinely difficult and slow with just 2 or 3 people, but goes remarkably fast with 15 or 20 hands all working at once. These gatherings ran on a simple, unspoken understanding. You showed up to help your neighbor today because you knew your neighbor would show up to help you whenever your own turn came. Nobody kept strict count. It wasn't a formal trade or a contract. It was just how a small, isolated community made sure nobody had to face the biggest jobs entirely alone. Let's go a little deeper on the textile work too, since it occupied such a huge share of a woman's available time, especially earlier in this period before store-bought cloth became more widely affordable and accessible. Growing flax, for households that practiced this older method, took its own long stretch of seasonal labor. The flax had to be grown, pulled, dried, and then processed through several stages to separate the usable fiber from the rest of the plant, a process that involved repeatedly beating and combing the dried stalks until soft fiber could finally be pulled free. That fiber then got spun into thread on a spinning wheel, a task that could occupy hours of an evening, the spinning wheel's steady rhythmic sound becoming as familiar a part of household life as the crackle of the fireplace. Cotton, where it could be grown or obtained through trade, went through its own version of this same long process. Wool, from sheep that some mountain families kept, required washing, carding to straighten the fibers, and spinning before it could finally become usable thread or yarn. Once thread existed, weaving turned it into actual cloth, usually on a loom kept in the house or in a small separate building. Weaving was slow, careful work, requiring real skill that took years to fully develop. A woman known in her community as a particularly good weaver held a kind of quiet, respected status, the same way a particularly skilled blacksmith or carpenter might among the men. Once cloth existed, finally, it still had to be cut and sewn into actual clothing by hand. Since sewing machines remained rare and expensive in many of these remote households well into the later decades of this period. Every shirt, every dress, every pair of trousers represented this entire long chain of labor, stretching back through weaving, through spinning, through the original growing of flax or cotton or the shearing of wool. It's genuinely hard to overstate how much quiet, patient effort sat behind something as simple as a clean shirt on a Sunday morning. As manufactured cloth became more available later in the 1800s, purchased through whatever small country store served a given area, some of this burden eased. But sewing itself remained constant. Since buying ready-made clothing stayed rare and expensive for most mountain families well into the 1900s. The sewing basket, kept near the fireplace, stayed in nearly constant use, mending the same garments over and over until they simply couldn't be patched anymore. Beyond farming and household work, a holler often had a small handful of specialized trades scattered among its families, and these tradespeople filled needs the rest of the community couldn't easily meet on their own. A blacksmith, where one lived nearby, handled metalwork that was simply beyond most households' own ability, repairing a plow blade, shaping a new hinge for a door, making or fixing the metal parts of tools and wagons. This work required a forge, real heat, and years of learned skill, so a community blacksmith held a genuinely valued position, often trading his services for food, labor, or whatever else a family could offer in place of scarce cash. A miller, running a small water-powered grist mill along a creek with enough flow to turn the wheel, ground corn into meal for families across a wide area. Bringing corn to the mill and waiting while it got ground was its own small errand and social occasion both, since families from different parts of the holler or even neighboring hollers might cross paths there, exchanging news while their corn was processed. Some communities had a cooper, skilled in making barrels and buckets from wood staves bound together with metal or wooden hoops, essential containers for storing everything from water to preserved food. Others had someone skilled specifically in tanning leather, turning animal hides into usable material for shoes, harnesses, and other goods. Midwives held perhaps the most consistently needed specialized role of all. Given how regularly births happened in these large mountain families and how far away any kind of formal doctor usually was. A skilled, experienced midwife, often an older woman who had learned through years of practice and through her own mother or grandmother before her, attended births across a wide area, called on at all hours, in all weather, whenever her particular knowledge was needed. These tradespeople weren't separate from farm life, generally. A blacksmith likely still kept his own garden and a few animals, the same as everyone else. His blacksmith work supplemented rather than replaced the basic farming labor that sustained every household. This blending of specialized skill with ordinary farm work was simply how these communities managed to have access to skills they couldn't each individually possess, without needing anything like a formal cash economy to support full-time specialists. Let's take a slower, fuller pass through the whole farming year now, since it's worth understanding just how completely the calendar shaped the rhythm of a mountain family's work. Late winter, even before the ground had properly thawed, brought the first real planting of the year ahead. Seed corn, saved carefully from the best ears of the previous harvest, got checked over and sorted, making sure enough good seed existed for the coming planting season. Tools got repaired during this slower stretch, fences mended, anything that had broken or worn down over the winter set right before the busier months arrived. Early spring brought the actual planting, timed carefully around that last expected frost. Corn went into the ground first, usually, since it formed the backbone of the whole year's food supply. The garden followed shortly after, with beans, squash, and other vegetables planted once the soil had warmed enough to give them a real chance. This same season brought a particular flurry of activity around new animal life, too. Calves, born in spring in a lot of mountain herds, needed watching. Baby chicks, whether hatched naturally under a hen or otherwise, needed protecting from the cold and from predators until they'd grown sturdy enough to manage on their own. It was, in its own quiet way, a genuinely hopeful season, full of new growth in every direction a family looked. Late spring and early summer brought the steady work of tending everything that had been planted. Weeding, mostly an endless task on a mountain farm where weeds competed just as eagerly for the same limited good soil as the crops a family actually wanted to grow. This was also when the first hay cutting happened for families who kept enough livestock to need stored feed for the coming winter, cut by hand with a scythe and dried carefully before being stored away in a barn loft. Midsummer brought the heaviest, hottest stretch of work in the entire year. Corn needed continued tending. The garden needed harvesting as different vegetables came ready at different times through these weeks. And this was also, as we discussed, the season for the bulk of the year's canning, layering one demanding task directly on top of another, with very little real rest in between. Late summer eased slightly, relatively speaking, as the heaviest planting and tending work wound down, though harvest itself was just beginning to ramp up for certain crops. This stretch sometimes allowed for a little more of the social gathering and entertainment we talked about earlier, since the absolute most demanding labor of the year had finally passed. Fall, as we've covered, brought the main harvest, the hog killing, and a final push to make sure everything needed for winter had been properly preserved and stored. This was genuinely one of the busiest stretches of the entire year, second only to the height of summer, with families racing against the calendar to get everything in before the first hard frost or, eventually, the first real snow. And then winter closed the cycle, bringing that slower, quieter season we touched on earlier. Less field work, more time, relatively, for repairing tools, mending clothes, and the kind of indoor handwork that filled long winter evenings by the fire. Even this quieter season carried its own steady list of chores, of course. The animals still needed feeding every single day, regardless of how cold or how much snow had fallen overnight. But compared to the relentless pace of summer and fall, winter offered mountain families something closer to genuine rest, even if that rest still came wrapped inside a long list of ongoing responsibilities. This whole yearly cycle repeated, season after season, decade after decade, for generation after generation of families living this same way up in these same hills. The specific years changed. The specific faces working these same fields changed as one generation gave way to the next. But the underlying rhythm, the steady turning from planting to tending to harvest to rest and back to planting again, stayed remarkably constant, a kind of patient, unhurried heartbeat running underneath the whole of Appalachian mountain life. Section 3: Food and Eating. Let's slow down even more now and talk about food. Food in an Appalachian mountain household followed the seasons closely, a lot more closely than most of us experience today. There was no year-round supply of fresh anything. What you ate depended almost entirely on what time of year it was, what had been preserved from the last harvest, and what the land around the cabin happened to provide. Corn was the backbone of the whole diet. Cornbread showed up at most meals, sometimes every single meal in a given day. It was cheap to grow, it kept well once dried and ground into meal, and it filled a person up. Cornbread got made plain most days, mixed with water or buttermilk, a little salt, maybe some bacon grease for flavor, then baked in a skillet right over the fire or in a small oven if the family had one. Beans were the other steady presence. Dried beans, soaked and cooked slow, often with a piece of salt pork thrown in for flavor. Those leather breeches we talked about earlier, the dried green beans hung up to cure, got soaked and cooked the same way through the winter months, once the fresh garden beans were long gone. Pork was the main meat in most mountain households. Hog killing usually happened once a year, in the late fall or early winter, once the weather turned cold enough to keep the meat from spoiling during the process. This was a big communal event, like we mentioned, with neighbors helping out because it took more hands than one family had on its own. Once the hog was killed and processed, almost nothing went to waste. The meat got salted and smoked to preserve it through the year. The fat got rendered into lard, which became the household's main cooking fat for the next 12 months. Even the less obviously useful parts, the feet, the organs, got turned into food somehow. Nothing got thrown away that didn't absolutely have to be. Chicken showed up too, though usually for special occasions or Sunday dinners rather than every single day, since a laying hen was more valuable alive, producing eggs, than she was as a single meal. Eggs themselves were a steady, reliable source of protein, gathered fresh most mornings. A milk cow, when a family had one, provided milk, butter, and buttermilk, which got used in cooking constantly. Buttermilk biscuits, buttermilk in the cornbread, buttermilk just to drink, on its own, especially appreciated on a hot summer day. Wild food filled in the gaps. And this is one of those areas where mountain families had genuinely deep, specific knowledge passed down through generations. They knew which greens were safe to eat in the early spring, before the garden had really gotten going yet. Poke greens, even though the plant is toxic if you don't prepare it correctly, and the preparation involved boiling it more than once. changing the water each time to draw out the dangerous part before eating it. Wild onions, ramps, which are a strong, garlicky wild plant that grows up in these mountains and which people still go out and gather today the same way their grandparents did. Berries got picked all through the warmer months. Blackberries, especially, which grow thick and wild all through Appalachian hillsides. Families picked them by the bucketful and turned them into jam, jelly, or simple cobblers, and any extra got dried or canned to stretch through the winter. Hunting and fishing added to the table as well, mostly handled by the men and older boys, though not exclusively. Squirrel, rabbit, deer when one could be found and taken, and fish from the mountain streams when the season and the weather cooperated. None of this was sport in the way we might think of hunting today. It was simply part of how the family got fed, no different in spirit from tending the garden or milking the cow. Here's a boring fact that I think genuinely deserves a moment of attention because it's easy to miss. Mountain families thought carefully, even if not scientifically by our standards, about getting enough variety in their diet. They knew, through plain old experience passed down from their own parents and grandparents, that eating nothing but corn and pork for too long made people sick, weak, tired in a way that wasn't just regular tiredness. So the garden vegetables, the wild greens, the berries, these weren't just nice extras. They were a real, if informal, understanding that the body needed more than just the heavy, filling staples to actually stay healthy. Canning became a hugely important household skill once glass jars and proper canning lids became widely available, sometime around the later part of the 1800s and especially into the early 1900s. Before that, preserving food meant drying, salting, or smoking, mostly. Once canning caught on, a mountain kitchen in late summer turned into something close to a small, hot, steam-filled factory for a few weeks, with the woman of the house, and usually her daughters too, putting up jar after jar of beans, tomatoes, corn, fruit, anything that could be safely sealed and stored for the coming winter. A full pantry shelf of canned goods, lined up jar after the harvest, was a genuine source of quiet pride and real security for a mountain family. It meant the difference between a comfortable winter and a hungry one. Meals themselves were simple, plain, and repetitive, the same way the rest of mountain life was. Breakfast we already covered: cornbread or biscuits, some kind of pork, maybe eggs, maybe milk, or that chicory substitute for coffee. The midday meal, often called dinner rather than lunch in this region, tended to be the largest meal of the day, eaten when the sun was high and the morning's heaviest work was already done. This is actually the opposite pattern from how a lot of us eat today, where the evening meal is usually the big one. In farm country, the midday meal needed to be substantial because there was still a full afternoon of hard physical work ahead, and you needed real fuel to get through it. Supper, in the evening, tended to be lighter. Leftovers from dinner, sometimes. Maybe just cornbread and milk, or cornbread and a little buttermilk, especially in households that were stretching their supplies carefully toward the end of a long winter. Eating itself happened around a simple table, usually made by the family or a local craftsman rather than bought somewhere. No fancy dinnerware. Plain plates, plain cups, plain spoons and forks, sometimes a mix of materials depending on what the family could afford or had managed to acquire over the years. Grace was said before meals in most households, a quiet moment of thanks before anybody touched their food, reflecting just how seriously these families took the basic fact of having enough to eat. Food wasn't something to take for granted. A bad harvest, a hard winter, a sick milk cow, any of these things could turn a comfortable household into a genuinely hungry one. So that quiet, simple moment of thanks before a meal carried real weight. Let's slow all the way down here, the way we've been doing, and just sit with the picture for a second. A wooden table, plain plates, the smell of cornbread, warm from the skillet. A pot of beans that's been simmering most of the afternoon, slow and patient, the same way almost everything in this life moved. A jar of preserved blackberries, opened special for the evening meal. Children washed up and seated, a little tired from the day's chores, ready to eat. No fancy china, no electric lights overhead, just a warm meal, made from what the land had given that year, shared together at the end of a long, steady day. That's the real, quiet truth of food in Appalachian mountain life. Plain, repetitive, built almost entirely around what the seasons provided, and built around the patient, careful work of making sure that what came in during the warm months would still be there to eat once the cold months arrived. Let's slow down even more and think about how that whole yearly food cycle actually worked, start to finish. In late winter and early spring, supplies usually ran lowest. Whatever had been canned or dried the previous fall was getting thin on the shelf by this point. This was the season when wild greens mattered most, since they were often the first fresh food available after a long winter of mostly dried beans and salted pork. Families watched closely for the first poke greens and the first ramps pushing up through the cold ground, almost the way you might watch for the first real sign that winter was finally loosening its grip. By late spring and into summer, the garden started producing steadily, and meals shifted to include more fresh vegetables. This was also, somewhat ironically, one of the busiest seasons for work, so a lot of the fresh produce got eaten simply, quickly, without much fuss, since nobody had the spare time for anything elaborate. Late summer brought the heaviest preserving work, as we talked about, with canning filling up entire weeks at a stretch. This was hot, sweaty, demanding labor, made harder by the fact that it usually happened during the hottest part of the year, with a fire going constantly to heat water for the canning process, right in a kitchen that already had no real ventilation to speak of. Fall brought the harvest proper, and with it, that one big hog killing that supplied the year's main meat. It also brought a brief window of real abundance, before winter set back in and supplies had to be stretched carefully again. And then winter, finally, when the household lived mostly off what had been put up earlier in the year. Corn, ground fresh as needed, dried beans, smoked and salted pork, canned vegetables and fruit, opened sparingly, with an eye toward making sure there'd be enough left to last until spring's first wild greens showed up again. This cycle repeated year after year with very little variation. A bad harvest one year meant a leaner winter to follow. A good one meant a little more comfort. But the basic shape of it, the slow turning from scarcity to abundance and back to scarcity again, stayed remarkably consistent across generations of families living this same way, up in these same hills. Let's slow down once more and look closely at the actual tools and methods these families used for cooking, since the process looked nothing like a modern kitchen. A cast iron skillet was probably the single most important piece of cooking equipment in any mountain home. Heavy, nearly indestructible, and able to go straight into the coals of a fireplace, a good skillet got passed down through a family for generations, growing more seasoned and more prized with every year of use. Cornbread, fried meat, and just about everything else that needed direct heat got cooked in one of these. A Dutch oven, a heavier covered pot with legs that let it sit directly over coals, served for baking. Biscuits, when there was flour to spare. Sometimes a simple cake for a special occasion. The coals went both underneath and on top of the lid, creating something close to a real oven's even heat, just using fire instead of any kind of built-in mechanism. A large iron pot, hung from a swinging arm built right into the fireplace itself, handled the bigger jobs. Boiling a large batch of beans, heating water for washing or for canning. This pot might stay hanging over the fire for hours at a stretch, simmering away slowly while the rest of the household's work continued around it. As the decades passed and a family's circumstances allowed, a proper cast iron cook stove sometimes replaced the open hearth as the main cooking method, especially once these stoves became more affordable and more available even out in remote areas. A stove offered real advantages: more controlled heat, a separate firebox that kept smoke more contained, multiple cooking surfaces at once, instead of working around a single open fire. But plenty of households held on to their old hearth cooking methods well alongside a stove, or instead of one entirely, right up through the early 1900s in some of the more remote hollers. None of this cooking happened quickly by our standards. There was no flipping a switch and getting instant heat. Fires had to be built and tended, coals had to reach the right temperature, and a cook had to know, through long practice rather than any dial or display, exactly how hot a fire needed to be for a particular dish, and exactly how long something needed to sit before it was done. This knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, the same way so much else in mountain life did, through years of simply watching and helping before finally taking on the cooking responsibilities herself. Let's talk a little about how mountain families actually got the small handful of food items they couldn't grow or raise themselves, since real cash money stayed genuinely scarce for a lot of these households for a long stretch of this era. A small country store, where one existed within reasonable distance, ran heavily on a system of barter and credit rather than straight cash transactions. A family might bring in eggs, butter, or a portion of their harvest, trading these goods directly for the few things they couldn't produce on their own land. Coffee, if a family wanted it. Sugar, used sparingly given how expensive it usually was relative to a mountain family's limited cash income. Salt, genuinely essential for preserving meat through the winter, and one of the few items that simply had to be purchased since salt deposits weren't something most families could access on their own. The store owner kept careful track of these running accounts, sometimes letting a family run a balance through a lean stretch to be settled later once the harvest came in or once some other source of income arrived. This system required real trust between a store owner and the surrounding families. Trust built up over years, sometimes generations, of dealing honestly with each other. Some families, especially in more remote hollers without easy access to any store at all, relied even more heavily on direct trade between neighbors. A family with a particularly good crop of one vegetable might trade their surplus directly with a neighbor who had extra of something else, without any money or store changing hands at all. This kind of direct neighbor to neighbor trading rounded out a household's supplies in ways that pure self sufficiency alone couldn't quite manage. Coffee deserves a particular mention here, actually, since it sat right at this interesting edge between necessity and luxury for a lot of mountain families. Genuinely poor households sometimes went without it entirely, relying instead on substitutes like roasted chicory root or even roasted grain, as we mentioned earlier. Families with a little more access to cash or trade goods treated real coffee as a genuine, appreciated comfort, brewed carefully and consumed without waste, savored rather than taken for granted the way we might treat it today. Sugar followed a similar pattern. Honey, where a family kept bees or could gather it from wild hives, served as a more accessible sweetener for a lot of households. Maple syrup, in areas where sugar maple trees grew, provided another homegrown alternative, tapped and boiled down through a labor-intensive process each early spring, when the tree sap was running at just the right consistency and concentration. This whole system, this blend of direct farming, careful trading, and occasional cash purchases for the few things that absolutely required them, kept these mountain households fed and supplied across generations, without ever requiring much in the way of actual money changing hands. It's a genuinely different way of moving through an entire economic life than most of us experience today, and there's something almost peaceful in picturing it, slow and steady, running quietly underneath everything else these families did. Section 4: Homes and Shelter. Now let's walk through the house itself. Slowly, like a quiet tour through a home that's been still and empty for 100 years, except imagine it full of life, the way it actually was. Most Appalachian mountain homes started out as simple log cabins, and a lot of them stayed that way for the family's whole time living there, especially out in the more remote hollers where bringing in milled lumber was difficult and expensive. A typical early cabin had just one room, one single room that did everything. Cooking happened there, at the fireplace. Eating happened there, at the table. Sleeping happened there too, often with the whole family in the same space, beds tucked into corners or along the walls. As families grew, or as they had a little more money or time, a second room sometimes got added on, maybe a loft space built up under the roofline where children slept, giving the parents a bit more room and privacy below. The logs themselves were usually cut right from the surrounding mountainside, notched at the corners so they'd stack together and hold without needing much in the way of nails or hardware, which were expensive and hard to come by out in remote areas anyway. The gaps between the logs got filled with a mixture of mud, clay, and sometimes moss or straw mixed in, a process called chinking, which helped keep the wind and the cold out during the harsh mountain winters. Floors were often just packed dirt in the earliest cabins, though plank floors became more common as families settled in and had time to mill or trade for proper lumber. A dirt floor, despite how that sounds, could actually be kept quite clean and firm with regular sweeping and care. It wasn't the muddy mess you might be picturing. The fireplace was the absolute heart of the home, in every sense of that phrase. It provided heat, obviously, which mattered enormously during Appalachian winters that could get bitterly cold up in the higher elevations. It provided light, since most cabins had few windows, and the ones they did have were small, sometimes covered with oiled paper or simple wooden shutters rather than glass, which was expensive and fragile to transport into the mountains. And the fireplace provided the means for cooking every single meal, since nobody had a separate kitchen stove in the earliest version of mountain life. Furniture was simple, practical, and usually homemade. A table, a few chairs, sometimes simple stools instead, beds with wooden frames, strung with rope to support a mattress filled with corn husks or, for families who could manage it, feathers. Corn husk mattresses were common because corn was already being grown anyway, so the husks were a free and renewable resource, even if they weren't the softest thing to sleep on. Storage was simple too. A few shelves built into the wall, maybe a single chest or trunk holding the family's good clothes, important papers if they had any, or treasured items passed down from earlier generations. There wasn't a lot of stuff by modern standards. Most families owned relatively few possessions, and what they did own tended to be practical, used hard, and repaired rather than replaced when it broke. Lighting at night, once the sun went down, came from the fireplace itself, supplemented by candles if the family had the means to make or buy them. Candle making was its own seasonal household task, much like canning, with tallow rendered from animal fat poured into molds or dipped repeatedly around a wick until a usable candle had built up. Some families used a simpler, even more old-fashioned method involving a twisted rag soaked in grease, called a grease lamp or sometimes a slut lamp, which produced a dim, smoky light, but light all the same. Heating, beyond the fireplace, mostly came down to one simple solution: more blankets, more layers of clothing, and sometimes simply going to bed earlier in the winter months when daylight was short and firewood needed to be conserved. Quilts, which we mentioned earlier as a social activity for women, serve this very direct, practical purpose too. A good thick quilt, or several layered together, could make the difference on a genuinely cold mountain night. Water, as we covered earlier, came from a spring or a well rather than indoor plumbing, which simply did not exist for most of these households for most of this era. A wash basin near the door, filled fresh each day, served for basic washing up. Bathing happened less frequently than we'd consider normal today, often just once a week, usually on a Saturday night in preparation for church the next morning, with a large tub brought in and filled with water heated over the fire, used by multiple family members in succession before it was emptied out. Outhouses, set a respectful distance from the main cabin, handled what indoor plumbing handles for us today. Simple, practical, and about as unglamorous a detail of daily life as you could ask for, but a completely ordinary and unremarkable part of how these households actually functioned. As families had more resources, or as the decades moved forward into the later 1800s and early 1900s, homes sometimes grew more elaborate. A real wood frame house might eventually replace the original log cabin, with proper glass windows, a separate kitchen area, more than just one or two rooms, a front porch, too, which became an absolutely central feature of mountain home life, and one that's actually still associated with this region today. The porch was where people sat in the evenings, where visiting happened, where a cool breeze could be caught on a hot summer night when the inside of the house held onto the day's heat. Let's slow down here again and just sit in this picture a while. A single room, warm from the fire, dim with candlelight, or just the glow of the coals. The smell of wood smoke, always present, soaked into the very walls and the clothing of everyone who lived there. A quilt folded at the foot of a bed, made from scraps of old clothing, each piece carrying its own small history. A shelf with a few jars of preserved food, lined up neat, a quiet kind of security against the winter ahead. Outside, the dark shape of the mountain ridge against a sky full of more stars than most of us ever get to see anymore, since there was no electric light for miles around to wash any of it out. That's an Appalachian mountain home. Simple, sturdy, built mostly by the family's own hands, out of whatever the mountain itself provided, and lived in across generations with very little changing from one decade to the next. Let's spend a little more time inside this house, because there are a few small, ordinary details worth slowing down on. Cleaning a mountain cabin didn't look much like cleaning a modern home. There was no vacuum, obviously, no spray cleaners, none of that. A broom, usually homemade from straw or twigs bundled together, handled the floors. Walls and surfaces got wiped down with simple cloths, sometimes dampened with water, sometimes just used dry to knock dust loose. Once a year, often in spring, a lot of households did a more thorough cleaning, sometimes called spring cleaning, the very same phrase we still use today, where bedding got aired out, surfaces got scrubbed more carefully, and the whole house got a kind of fresh start after a long winter of closed windows and smoky fires. Smoke, actually, was a constant presence inside these homes, more than we'd probably find comfortable today, with the fireplace doing all the cooking and heating, and with chimneys that didn't always draw perfectly. A certain amount of smoke just settled into daily life. Walls darkened over time from it. Clothing carried the smell of it. This wasn't considered a problem, particularly. It was just part of how a home like this worked. Pest control, in a rough sense, mattered too. Mice and other small creatures were a constant low-level concern, given how much food was stored right there in the house. Cats earned their keep in a lot of these households specifically by keeping the mouse population down, which made them genuinely useful animals rather than simply pets in the way we think of them today. As for keeping warm beyond just the fireplace and the quilts, families also paid close attention to keeping drafts out. That chinking between the logs needed regular checking and repair, since mud and clay could crack and fall away over time, especially after a hard freeze. A draft that got in could undo a lot of the fire's hard work. So checking and patching the chinking was a regular, ongoing task, not something done once and forgotten. The porch, once homes had grown enough to include one, served a purpose beyond just evening relaxation, too. It was where a lot of food preparation happened in warm weather. since cooking and canning over a hot fire made the inside of the cabin unbearably hot in summer. Shelling beans, stringing those leather breeches we mentioned earlier, peeling vegetables for canning. A lot of this happened sitting right there on the porch, in the shade, with whatever breeze happened to be moving through the holler that day. So a mountain home wasn't just a shelter to sleep in. It was a workshop, a kitchen, a gathering place, and eventually, once the porch came along, an extension of all of that out into the open air. Every part of it built and maintained by the family itself, patched and repaired rather than replaced, lived in fully and completely, generation after generation. Let's spend a little more time on the furniture and the smaller objects that filled these homes, since each one tells its own quiet story. Chairs in a mountain home were often what's called ladder-back chairs, simple wooden frames with a seat woven from hickory bark or corn husks rather than upholstered fabric. A man skilled in chair making might supply several families in a holler with this kind of basic furniture, trading his work for other goods or services rather than cash, since cash itself stayed scarce in a lot of these communities for a long time. A spinning wheel, where one existed in the household, often held a place of real importance, sometimes positioned near a window for the best light, used so constantly that it became almost a fixture of the room rather than a piece of equipment that got put away. A cradle, simple and handmade, rocked whichever baby happened to be youngest in the household at any given time, then got set aside and brought back out again whenever the next child arrived. Many of these cradles stayed in a family for multiple generations, holding babies who would grow up, have their own children, and eventually rock their own grandchildren in that very same simple wooden frame. Tools themselves, kept just outside the main living space or in a small attached shed, represented a real investment of money or trade goods that a family protected carefully. An axe, a hoe, a plow, if the family didn't have to borrow one from a neighbor. These objects got maintained, sharpened, and repaired far more often than they ever got replaced, since a new tool meant either real money the family often didn't have, or a long trip to the nearest store or blacksmith. And then there were the small, personal objects that carried no real practical use beyond comfort and memory. A Bible with names and dates written carefully inside the front cover, recording births and deaths going back generations. A small box holding a few precious keepsakes, a lock of hair, perhaps, from a child who hadn't survived infancy, or a letter from a relative who'd moved far away. These objects, modest as they were, carried enormous weight for the families who kept them, weight that had nothing to do with how much anything cost, and everything to do with the memories attached. Even in a home with so few possessions by modern standards, every single object tended to matter. Nothing sat around and used or forgotten. Everything had its purpose, its place, and very often, its own small history within the family that owned it. There's one more part of home life worth slowing down on, since it touched every single household eventually, whether they wanted it to or not. And that's how these families handled sickness and injury, given how far away any formal doctor usually was. A lot of mountain families relied on a body of practical, herbal knowledge passed down through generations, mostly held and practiced by the women of the household. Certain plants, gathered from the surrounding woods and hillsides, became remedies for common complaints. Catnip tea for an upset stomach, especially in small children. Mullein leaves for chest congestion. Witch hazel, made from the bark of a shrub that grows wild through these mountains, used for cuts, bruises, and general skin irritation. This knowledge wasn't written down in most households, since formal medical texts were rare and expensive, and many families had limited reading material to begin with. Instead, it passed the same way so much else did in mountain culture, through direct teaching, mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, learned by watching and helping long before a young woman ever needed to use this knowledge on her own household. A simple home medicine chest, where a family kept one, might hold a small number of purchased items alongside the home gathered herbs. A bit of quinine, if the family lived somewhere malaria was a concern, which it was in parts of this region for a long stretch of this era. Some basic salve for wounds. Perhaps a small bottle of liniment for sore muscles after a long day of heavy labor. For anything more serious than these home remedies could handle, a family faced a genuinely difficult choice. The nearest doctor in many of these remote hollers might be a half day's travel away or more over rough trail that made transporting a badly injured or seriously ill person both slow and risky in its own right. Some communities eventually had access to a country doctor who traveled a regular circuit between scattered settlements. But even this kind of care remained limited and uncertain compared to what we take for granted today. This reality shaped families in quiet, lasting ways. It meant a real premium got placed on caution, on careful work, on simply avoiding injury and illness wherever possible, since the consequences of a bad accident or a serious sickness carried so much more weight than they might today. It also meant families leaned heavily on each other and on whatever inherited knowledge they had, simply because there often wasn't another option readily available. None of this is meant to sound grim, particularly. It's simply one more part of how thoroughly self-reliant these mountain households needed to be in nearly every part of daily life, including the parts involving their own health and safety. Section 5: Entertainment and Free Time. Let's talk now about what these families did when the work finally slowed down for the day. Because here's the thing the stereotypes get wrong almost as much as anything else. Mountain life wasn't all grim, silent labor. There was real warmth in it, real joy, real fun, even if it looked nothing like what counts as entertainment today. Music sat right at the center of a lot of mountain free time. And this is one area where Appalachia genuinely shaped American culture in a way that's still felt today. Fiddles were common, passed down through families, played at home in the evenings just for the simple pleasure of it. Banjos, too, an instrument with roots tracing back through African American communities and then adopted widely across these mountains, blending together over time into the distinct, recognizable sound we now just call old time or mountain music. A family might gather after supper, instruments in hand, if anybody in the household played, and just make music together for an hour or two before bed. No audience needed. No performance, really, in the way we'd think of one. Just the simple, Repeated comfort of familiar songs, the same handful played over and over, evening after evening, the same way a familiar meal gets cooked the same way night after night. Singing happened with or without instruments. Hymns, especially, were a constant presence, sung at home, sung at church, sung sometimes just while working through a chore, since a repetitive task like churning butter or shelling beans went easier with a little rhythm to keep time by. Storytelling filled a lot of evening hours too, and this is genuinely one of the most boring sounding, but actually quite lovely parts of mountain life to think about. Families told stories, passed down through generations, about ancestors, about local events, about ghosts and strange happenings up in the hills. Some of these stories were clearly meant to entertain. Others carried little lessons buried inside them, the kind of practical wisdom about danger or behavior that a community wanted its children to remember. A lot of these stories got told again and again, the exact same way, with very little variation from one telling to the next. That repetition wasn't boredom, exactly. It was comfort. Knowing exactly what was coming next in a familiar story is its own kind of quiet pleasure, the same way a familiar lullaby works for putting a child to sleep. Reading happened in households where literacy was common and books were available, though both of those things varied quite a bit depending on the family and how isolated they were. The Bible was, by far, the most common book in any mountain household that had books at all, read aloud in the evenings, studied closely, often the single most worn and handled object in the entire house. Almanacs were common too, useful for both their practical weather and planting information and for whatever bits of general reading material got included alongside that information. Games filled children's free time, and a lot of these games required nothing more than what was already lying around. Marbles, if a child had a set. Simple games involving sticks, stones, or whatever was at hand. Older children and adults sometimes played card games in the evening, when cards were available and when the particular family or community didn't have strong objections to card playing, which some did for religious reasons. Quilting bees, which we mentioned earlier, doubled as both necessary work and genuine social entertainment for women. Neighbors gathering together, working on a quilt collectively, talking, sharing news, sharing the kind of small community gossip that every tight knit community has always run on, in every era, everywhere. Honestly, when you think about it, that's not so different from a group chat today. Different tools, same basic human need to stay connected with the people around you. Church gatherings provided some of the biggest social occasions available to mountain families, especially in communities spread out enough that people didn't see their neighbors all that often otherwise. Sunday services, obviously, but also revivals, which sometimes ran for several days at a stretch, drawing in families from a wide area, turning into as much a social event as a religious one. Food got shared, news got exchanged, young people got a rare, sanctioned chance to spend time together, which mattered quite a bit in communities where courtship otherwise had very few natural opportunities to happen. Dances happened too, in some communities, though attitudes toward dancing varied a fair bit depending on the particular church and family's beliefs. Where dances did happen, They tended to be lively, communal affairs. Square dances, reels, the same fiddle and banjo music that filled quiet evenings at home, now turned up and played for a room full of moving feet. Here's a boring fact I think is genuinely worth sitting with for a second, because it's one of those things that feels surprisingly familiar across all this distance and time. People gossiped constantly. Mountain communities were small, tight, and everybody knew everybody's business, the same way small towns and tight communities still work today. Who was courting who? Whose crop had come in good this year and whose hadn't? Whose cow had wandered into whose garden? This wasn't mean-spirited, usually. It was just how a small community stayed connected, how news traveled, how people kept track of each other's lives in a world without telephones or newspapers showing up regularly. Letters, for families who could read and write and who had relatives living elsewhere, served a similar function across longer distances. A letter from a relative who'd moved away, maybe out west, maybe to a city for work, was a genuinely treasured event, read multiple times, sometimes read aloud to the whole family, sometimes kept and reread again months or years later. In the evenings, once supper was finished and the day's heaviest work was truly done, families often just sat on the porch in warm weather, by the fire in cold weather, talking a little, maybe humming or singing, watching the light fade over the ridgeline. There wasn't always something specific happening. Sometimes the evening's entertainment was simply rest itself, a kind of quiet, unhurried sitting together that modern life, with all its screens and constant noise, doesn't always make room for anymore. Let's slow all the way down here, the way we like to in these sections, and just picture an evening, all the way through, slow and easy. Supper's finished. The dishes are put away. Outside, the light over the mountains is turning that deep gold color that happens right before dusk really sets in. Somebody picks up a fiddle, just because, and starts playing something familiar, something that's been played in this family for longer than anybody currently living can quite remember learning it. Children sit on the porch steps, tired from a day of chores, listening without really thinking about listening. An older relative tells the same story they've told 100 times before, and everybody settles in to hear it again anyway, because the comfort isn't in the surprise. It's in the familiar shape of it. Eventually, the music slows. The story winds down. One by one, people start drifting off toward bed, the same unhurried way they've drifted toward sleep every single evening of their lives. That's mountain entertainment. Quiet, communal, built almost entirely around music, stories, and each other's company, rather than anything bought or manufactured or performed for an audience. No movie screens, no feuds breaking out on the porch, just people, together, easing into the evening the same gentle way, night after night, season after season. Let's slow down and add a little more to this picture, because there's more worth knowing about how these communities came together. Courtship in these mountain communities tended to happen slowly, and mostly in public, supervised settings, given how few opportunities young people actually had to spend time together otherwise. Church gatherings, as we mentioned, served this purpose well. So did the various work gatherings, Since a corn shucking or a quilting be brought together young men and women from different families across the holler, all working alongside each other for an afternoon or an evening. A young man interested in a young woman might find small, simple ways to spend a little extra time near her during one of these gatherings, or might walk a longer way than strictly necessary just for the chance to accompany her partway home afterward. None of this looked dramatic by modern standards. It was slow, careful, and almost entirely visible to the whole watching community, which is exactly how most families wanted it. Holidays brought their own particular rhythm to mountain life, too. Christmas, when it came, tended to be a quieter, simpler occasion than what most of us picture today. Gifts, if given at all, were usually small and practical. A new pair of socks, hand-knit, perhaps a small toy, carved by hand. The real center of a mountain Christmas was usually food and family, gathered together, rather than any large exchange of presents. Independence Day, by contrast, sometimes brought bigger community gatherings, since it fell in summer when travel between hollers was easier and the harvest work hadn't yet hit its busiest stretch. A community might gather for a shared meal, some music, maybe a few simple games or contests, the whole event organized informally, without much planning beyond word passed along from one family to the next. And then there were the seasons of revival meetings we touched on earlier, which for some communities became almost like an annual holiday in their own right. Families traveled in from across a wide area, sometimes camping near the church grounds for the duration, turning what was at its core a religious event into one of the larger social occasions of the entire year. Through all of this, the underlying pattern stayed the same. Mountain communities made their own entertainment out of whatever they already had. Music they already knew how to play, stories already passed down, gatherings built around work that needed doing anyway. Nothing purchased, nothing imported from outside, just people finding ways to enjoy each other's company within the rhythm of lives that were, by necessity, mostly given over to steady, unglamorous work. Let's slow down and spend a little more time on the storytelling itself, since it's one of the genuinely distinctive things about how mountain communities pass down their history and their values. A lot of mountain storytelling traced back, in its roots and its style, to the older folk traditions that Scots, Irish, and English settlers had carried with them when they first arrived in these hills generations earlier. Stories about clever animals, outsmarting bigger, stronger ones. Stories about ordinary people facing down some kind of trouble through wit rather than strength. Stories meant simply to be funny, built around an exaggeration or a misunderstanding that got more ridiculous with each retelling. A skilled storyteller in a community held a kind of quiet, respected role, the same way a skilled musician did. Children grew up hearing certain stories so many times that they could recite long stretches of them themselves, word for word, the cadence and rhythm of the telling becoming as familiar as a favorite song. Ghost stories had their own particular place in mountain storytelling tradition, often tied to specific, real locations within the local area. A particular bend in the creek, a particular old tree on a particular ridge. Children grew up knowing these local landmarks carried their own small legends attached to them, which made even a simple walk through familiar territory carry a little extra weight and wonder. Riddles and wordplay filled some evenings too. Simple games of wit that cost nothing and required no equipment beyond a sharp mind and a little patience. Some of these riddles have been passed down for so many generations that nobody remembered exactly where they'd originally come from. Only that grandparents had asked them of parents, who asked them of children, in an unbroken chain stretching back further than anyone could trace. All of this storytelling, all of this music, all of these familiar repeated evenings served a purpose beyond simple entertainment when you really think about it. They held a community together. They passed down values, history, and a shared sense of identity, all without ever needing a single book or a single classroom. A mountain family's evening by the fire was, in its own quiet way, doing some of the same work a school or a library does for us today. Let's spend a little more time on the church itself, too, since it served as so much more than just a place of worship in these communities. A small mountain church, often a simple wood frame or even log building not all that different from the houses surrounding it, served as the closest thing many hollers had to a true community center. Beyond Sunday services, the church building hosted funerals, occasional weddings, and the larger gatherings and revivals we mentioned earlier. It was often the one building in an entire holler large enough to hold a real crowd, which made it the natural choice for any event involving more than just a single family or two. The preacher, in many of these communities, was a local man, often someone who farmed and worked the land just like everyone else for most of the week, taking on preaching duties as much from a sense of calling and community need as from any formal religious training. Some communities shared a single preacher across several small churches, meaning services in any one location might only happen once or twice a month, with the preacher traveling a regular circuit between them. Singing in church followed its own particular tradition in a lot of these mountain communities, sometimes called shape note singing, a method using simple geometric shapes printed alongside the musical notes to help people who couldn't read standard sheet music still learn and sing parts together. This style produced a distinctive, powerful sound, voices blending together in patterns that had been taught and practiced this same way for generations, and it remains a tradition still practiced and celebrated in parts of these mountains today. Funerals carried their own deep significance in these tight communities, given how often death touched families at every age, from infant mortality through accidents and illness that modern medicine would handle very differently today. A funeral brought the whole surrounding community together, not just for the service itself, but often for days beforehand, as neighbors helped prepare food, dig a grave by hand in the family or church cemetery, and simply sit with the grieving family through the difficult days surrounding a loss. This blending of practical community support with religious faith ran through nearly everything the church touched in mountain life. It wasn't separate from daily survival and daily connection. It was woven directly into it, one more thread holding these small, scattered communities together across miles of difficult terrain and long stretches of isolation between visits. Section 6: The Night Routine. Let's slow down now. All the way down. Supper is over. The work is done. The fire has burned low. This is the part of the day where everything gets quiet. In an Appalachian mountain home, night came on slow. There was no sudden switch, no bright light clicking off all at once. Just a gradual dimming, hour by hour, as the fire settled and the candles, if any were lit, burned shorter. Children got tired early. They always do, after a full day of real, physical work. Little ones especially. By the time supper was cleared away, a small child might already be leaning against a parent's side, eyes heavy, barely keeping awake. Someone would carry them off to bed, gently, quietly, tucking them into a corn husk mattress under a heavy quilt, one that had probably been pieced together by hands in that very same house years before. The older children went next. Then, eventually, the adults. Before bed, there were just a few small things left to do. Banking the fire, for one. This meant covering the coals carefully with ash, so they'd hold their heat through the night without burning all the way out. A small, careful task, done the same way every single night, for as long as anyone could remember. Checking the door. Most mountain cabins had simple latches, nothing fancy, just enough to keep the door from blowing open in the wind. Maybe one last look out at the night sky, if the door was opened for even a moment. And what a sky it was. No electric lights anywhere for miles. No glow from a nearby town. Just darkness, deep and complete, with stars scattered across it in numbers that would shock most of us today, if we ever got the chance to see a sky like that. The mountains themselves would be dark shapes against that sky. Ridgelines, black against deep blue or black against black, depending on how late it was and how much moon there happened to be that night. Quiet. So quiet. The sounds that did exist at night were soft ones. Crickets, the occasional call of a whippoorwill, a bird known for its strange, repetitive call that carries easily across mountain hollers in the evening. Maybe the distant sound of a creek running. Somewhere nearby, low and steady, the same sound it had made the night before and the night before that. Wind moving through trees on the ridge above. A gentle sound, patient, never in a hurry. Inside the cabin, the air would be cooling now that the fire had been banked low. Families pulled their quilts up close. Sometimes 2 or 3 people sharing one bed, for warmth as much as for space, especially in winter. The room would be dark, truly dark, just the faint orange glow of the banked coals, low in the fireplace, the only light left in the whole house. That glow would pulse, very slightly, every now and then, a soft breath of orange, then fading back down to almost nothing, then another soft breath, like the fire itself was breathing, slow and easy, the same way the people sleeping nearby were breathing, in, out. Nothing else moving in the house now, just that small, steady glow, and the quiet. A mountain night is heavy in a comforting way, heavy like a good blanket, heavy like a body finally getting to rest after a long day of real work. Sleep came easily for most of these families, most nights. Not because life was simple in some movie sense, but because the body worked hard all day in fresh mountain air, simply needed the rest, and took it gladly when it came. There were no screens glowing in the dark, no notifications buzzing, no reason at all to stay awake past the point where the body wanted sleep. Just darkness, just quiet, just the soft, steady breathing of a family resting together, the way families in these mountains had rested together for generation after generation. The mountain outside stayed still all night. The creek kept running, low and steady, the same gentle sound it always made. The stars turned slowly overhead, the way they always do, marking the hours without anyone needing to watch a clock. And somewhere inside that small cabin, tucked under a quilt made from old, familiar scraps of cloth, a family slept. Deeply, quietly, the same way they had every night before, the same way they would again tomorrow night, and the night after that, and the night after that. No drama, no movie ending, just rest. Real, well earned, quiet rest. The kind that comes after a real day's work, in a real home, surrounded by real mountains that have stood there, patient and unmoving, for far longer than any family who ever lived among them. Let the quiet settle over you now, too. Let your body feel as heavy as that mountain night air. Let your breathing slow, the same way the fire's glow slowly faded down to almost nothing. There is nothing left to do tonight. No chores left. No fire left to tend. Just this. Just rest. Let's stay here a little longer, in this same quiet. Think about that mountain holler settling into full darkness. Think about the ridge above the cabin, holding its shape against the night sky the same way it has for longer than anyone can really measure. Think about the creek, still running, still patient, the same gentle sound it makes every single night, whether anyone is awake to hear it or not. Inside the cabin, everyone is asleep now, breathing slow, resting deep. Tomorrow will bring the fire again, and the cornbread, and the chores, and all of it will start over, the same patient way it always has. But that's tomorrow. Right now, there is only this. The dark room, the quilt, heavy and warm, the small, steady glow of the banked coals, pulsing softly, like a slow and patient breath. Let that same stillness settle over you now. You don't have to do anything else tonight. Just rest. Let's stay a while longer in this same quiet, slow place. Think about how many nights, exactly like this one, passed in these mountains. Hundreds of them, thousands of them across. All the families who ever lived this way, and all the hollers scattered through these ridges. Each one of those nights followed roughly the same pattern. Supper, the slow winding down of the evening. The fire, banked low. The quiet, deep dark, broken only by small, soft sounds. A whip-poor-will calling somewhere across the holler. A dog, maybe, shifting in its sleep near the porch. The creek, patient and steady, running the same path it always runs. Wind, gentle, moving through trees on the ridge above. None of it urgent. None of it demanding anything from anyone. Just the mountain, settling into its own long, slow nighttime rhythm. The same way it has for longer than any family who ever lived there could really measure. Inside the cabin, breathing slows further. Bodies grow heavier against the mattress. The mind, finally, lets go of the day's small worries, one by one. the same way the fire's light slowly fades down to nothing but a faint orange glow. Tomorrow, the rooster will call. The fire will need building again. The animals will need feeding. The whole familiar pattern will start over, fresh, the same way it always has. But that's tomorrow. Let's slow down even further into the deepest, quietest part of this night. Picture the mountain ridge above the cabin, dark against a sky scattered thick with stars. No clouds tonight, just clear, cold air and that endless quiet that settles over these hills once the last lamp has gone out in every cabin scattered through the holler. Somewhere down the slope, the creek keeps its same steady pace. It doesn't pause for winter. It doesn't pause for the deep dark of midnight. It simply runs, the same gentle sound, the same patient rhythm, whether anyone is awake to hear it or fast asleep under a heavy quilt. Inside the cabin, the family rests. A father, his hands rough from a day spent splitting wood or working the fields, finally still. A mother, who hauled water, cooked 3 meals, mended a torn shirt, and tended a sick chicken, finally allowed to simply lie down and let her body recover. Children, tucked close together for warmth, breathing slow and even, the small sounds of their breath blending with the quiet creak of the cabin settling in the cool night air. The fire, banked low hours ago, holds its last bit of warmth. Every so often, a coal shifts slightly beneath the ash, and a faint orange glow brightens for just a moment before fading back down. It happens slowly, patiently, the same way nearly everything in this life happened. Outside, an owl might call once, somewhere off in the dark trees. Then quiet again, a long stretch of nothing but wind, and the creek, and the occasional distant rustle of some small animal moving through the underbrush, unseen and unbothered by the sleeping family nearby. This is the deepest part of an Appalachian mountain night. Still, heavy, complete. Right now, lying where you are, you're sharing in something these families knew intimately every single night of their lives. The simple, total relief of rest, earned through a long day of real work, settling over a body finally allowed to be still. There's nothing more to do, nothing more to carry. Just this quiet, just this rest. Let it hold you, the same patient way that mountain night held every family who ever slept beneath it. Before we close out completely, let's slow down one more time and talk about something a little different. The way these mountain families actually talk to each other. Appalachian speech carried its own distinct character, shaped by isolation, by the specific mix of settlers who'd originally come into these hills, and by generations of families staying largely in the same hollers, talking the same way their parents and grandparents had talked before them. A lot of this speech traced its roots back to older English and Scots-Irish patterns, preserved here in these mountains partly because the isolation that shaped so much else about daily life also meant language didn't shift and blend with outside influence the way it did in busier, more connected parts of the country. Certain words and phrases that had mostly faded out of use elsewhere stayed alive and common here. simply because there was less regular contact pulling speech in new directions. You'd hear a feared instead of afraid sometimes. Reckon used constantly, the way other parts of the country might use suppose or guess. I reckon it'll rain today, somebody might say, looking up at clouds building over the ridge. Yonder pointed towards something at a middle distance, neither right here nor impossibly far away, a specific kind of over there with its own particular shade of meaning. Poke meant a small bag or sack, a word that's mostly faded from common use in a lot of the country but stayed common here for generations. Storytelling itself, which we already talked about, leaned on this same particular rhythm and word choice, giving mountain tales their own recognizable cadence, different from how the same basic story might get told in a city or in a different region entirely. Children picked up this way of speaking simply by growing up surrounded by it. The same way children everywhere absorb the speech patterns of their own family and community without ever consciously studying it. A child in one of these hollers sounded like their parents, who sounded like their own parents before them. Language passed down the same patient, unbroken way as the recipes, the quilts, and the stories. Outsiders, when they did occasionally pass through these mountains, sometimes found this speech difficult to follow at first, or unfairly assumed it reflected a lack of education rather than simply a different, equally legitimate dialect with its own deep roots and its own internal logic. This kind of misunderstanding, honestly, follows the exact same pattern as so much else we've talked about tonight. The outside world looked at something quiet, ordinary, and deeply rooted, and mistook its plainness for something lesser, when really it was just different, just its own thing, shaped by its own particular history. There's something worth appreciating in that. Actually, the same way there's something worth appreciating in everything else we've covered tonight. A whole distinct way of speaking, carried forward faithfully across generations, in these same quiet hollers, simply because that's how language had always sounded there, for as long as anyone could remember. Section 7 Appalachian speech and language approximate 980 words. Section 8 Raising a family in the mountains. Let's slow down once more and talk about something we've touched on here and there tonight, but haven't really sat with directly. What it actually meant to raise a family, start to finish, in one of these mountain hollers. Large families were simply the norm. 6, 8, sometimes 10 children or more wasn't unusual at all. Part of this came down to plain practical need, since more children eventually meant more hands available for all that constant farm and household work we've spent so much of tonight talking about. Part of it came down to the simple reality that, without reliable medicine or birth control, family size wasn't something most couples were actively choosing or limiting the way people often do today. Childbirth itself happened almost entirely at home, attended by a midwife or by experienced female relatives and neighbors, rather than in any kind of hospital or clinic, which simply didn't exist within any reasonable distance for most of these families. A midwife, as we mentioned earlier, held a deeply respected, constantly needed role in these communities, called on at all hours, through all kinds of weather, whenever her particular knowledge and steady hands were required. This meant childbirth carried real risk, more risk than most of us are used to thinking about today, given how much modern medicine has changed the picture. Mothers and babies both faced genuine danger during birth and in the days immediately following it, and a certain quiet, steady awareness of this risk ran underneath the whole experience for everyone involved. Families didn't dwell on this constantly, day to day, but it shaped, in a deep and lasting way, how seriously a safe birth and a healthy mother and child were treated once they'd made it through. Naming a new baby often followed family tradition closely. A child might carry a grandparent's name, or a name that had been passed down through several generations already, a small, steady thread connecting each new child to the long line of family that had come before them in these same hills. Raising young children, once they'd arrived safely, fell mostly to the mother, with real help from older siblings as soon as those siblings were old enough to take on some responsibility themselves. An older daughter, by the time she was 8 or 9, might be genuinely responsible for watching a baby or toddler for long stretches of the day, freeing her mother to handle cooking, garden work, or whatever other task needed doing. This created a particular rhythm within large families, where older children took on real, substantial caretaking roles well before they reached anything like adulthood themselves. It wasn't considered a burden exactly by the standards of the time. It was simply how a large household functioned, with each child, as they grew capable of more, taking on more, the same gradual, expected progression every child in the family experienced in turn. Discipline in these households tended to be straightforward and consistent, rooted heavily in the practical needs of farm and household life. Children needed to learn chores correctly, needed to understand danger around animals, tools, fire, and water, and needed to grow into capable, contributing members of the household relatively early in life, simply because the family's survival depended on everyone doing their part. Affection, though, ran alongside all this practical structure, the same as it does in families everywhere, in any era. Parents loved their children deeply, worried over them when they were sick, took quiet pride in watching them grow capable and strong. The evidence for this sits all through the personal letters and accounts that survive from this era and this region. Small, plain expressions of real tenderness, tucked in among all the practical details of daily survival. As children grew older, especially as they reached their teenage years, their role within the family shifted further still. Older boys worked alongside their fathers nearly as full equals, contributing real, substantial labor to the farm. Older girls did the same alongside their mothers, learning every piece of the long list of household skills they'd eventually need to run their own households one day. Since most of these young people stayed in or near the same holler their whole lives, marrying someone from a nearby family and starting this same cycle over again. This is, in the end, one of the most quietly remarkable things about Appalachian mountain family life, when you really sit with it. The same basic pattern, the same rhythm of work and rest, of childhood gradually deepening into adult responsibility repeated itself across generation after generation in these same hollers, among these same families, often for well over 100 years without major change. A child born into one of these families could look at their grandparents' lives and see, in broad outline, a fairly accurate preview of their own life still to come. There's something both humbling and steadying in that thought, if you let yourself sit with it the way we have tonight. A whole life, mapped out in advance, not by any single person's choice, but simply by the deep, patient continuity of mountain family life itself, passed down generation after generation in these same quiet hills. Oyutaro. So that's the quiet truth of Appalachian mountain families. Nothing like the movies. We talked about the mornings, the cold cabins, the fire that had to be coaxed back to life every single day, the plain breakfast of cornbread and salt pork, eaten before the sun had even fully cleared the ridgeline. We talked about the work, the fields cut into hillsides, the endless list of chores that filled up a woman's day from sunrise to well past sundown. The children working too, almost as soon as they were able, and the neighbors coming together for the heaviest jobs, turning hard labor into something a little easier to bear. We talked about the food, corn and beans and pork, the same simple staples, meal after meal, season after season. The wild greens and berries that filled in the gaps. The careful, steady work of canning enough to make it through a long winter. We talked about the homes. Simple log cabins, built by the family's own hands, warmed by a single fireplace that did the work of heating, cooking, and lighting all at once. Quilts made from old scraps of cloth, each one carrying a little bit of the family's own history stitched right into it. We talked about the evenings, the music, the stories told the same way, again and again, for the simple comfort of the familiar, the quiet pleasure of just sitting together once the work was finally done. We talked about the nights, the fire banked low, the stars, more than most of us will ever see again, the deep, complete quiet of a mountain holler after dark, broken only by crickets, or a far-off bird, or a creek running steady somewhere nearby. And we talked about the families themselves, the large households, the children growing into responsibility early, the same steady pattern of life passed down generation after generation in these same quiet hills. These families weren't characters in some old feud story. They weren't punchlines about isolated hill folk. They were people, tired, hardworking, occasionally funny, occasionally frustrated, mostly just getting through their days the best way they knew how, the same way families everywhere have always done. They had patience, they had each other, and they had this same steady, unhurried rhythm to their days, repeated so many times over so many years that it became, in its own quiet way, a kind of comfort all its own. That's the real history, the boring one, the one that's actually a lot more peaceful than anything Hollywood ever gave these mountains credit for. Let's take one more slow pass through everything before we let you go. Think about that morning fire, coaxed back to life from a few buried coals, the same careful way, every single day. Think about the corn, planted on a hillside too steep for most modern farm equipment to even attempt, tended by hand, season after season. Think about the women, managing an endless list of tasks that never had a clear stopping point, finding small moments of community and comfort within all that necessary labor anyway. Think about the simple cabin, built log by log from the mountain's own timber, warmed by a single fire that did the work of heating, cooking, and lighting all at once. Think about the quilts, pieced together from old, worn scraps of fabric, each one a small, warm record of the family's own history. Think about the evenings, filled with music that had been played the same way for generations, and stories told and retold not for the surprise of them, but for the comfort of their familiar shape. And think, finally, about the nights. Truly dark, truly quiet, a whole sky of stars overhead, with nothing at all to dim them. A creek running steady somewhere close by. A family resting together, the same unhurried way they had rested the night before and would rest again the night after. These mountains held this same slow, steady rhythm of life for generation after generation. Hard work, yes. Real difficulty, certainly, especially in the leaner years or the harder winters, but also a deep, abiding sense of community, of self sufficiency, of knowing exactly how each day was going to unfold, even before it began. That kind of certainty, that kind of steady sameness, might sound dull if you only think about it for a moment. But sit with it a little longer, the way we have tonight, and there's something genuinely comforting in it. A rhythm you could trust completely. A pattern that didn't change beneath your feet from one day to the next. Just real people, real days, real rest. Sleep well tonight.